My name is Miranda Adams, and at 32 years old, I never thought I would be standing face to face with my mother after years of separation, hearing those words again. You were my biggest regret. The statement that shaped my childhood now fueled my determination to prove her wrong. What I never expected was how this journey would transform not just her perception, but my entire understanding of worth and family. Before I dive into my story, where are you watching from today? Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to prove someone wrong about who you really are. I grew up in a modest suburban neighborhood just outside Boston, in a small blue house with chipped paint and a creaky front porch. Our family consisted of just 3 people: my mother Jennifer, my older brother Trevor, and me. My father had left when I was still a baby, a shadowy figure I knew only from a handful of faded photographs hidden in my mother's dresser drawer. From my earliest memories, I could feel the difference in how my mother treated Trevor and me. When Trevor spoke, my mother would lean in, her eyes bright with interest, nodding along to his every word. When I spoke, her attention seemed to drift away, her responses automatic and distant, as if I were background noise she had learned to tune out. I was 8 years old when I first realized this difference wasn't just in my imagination. It was my birthday, and I had been looking forward to it for weeks. I had dropped hints about the art set I wanted with its rainbow of paints and special drawing paper. I had even cut out a picture from a catalog and left it on the refrigerator. That morning, I woke up early, buzzing with excitement, and ran downstairs expecting balloons or pancakes with candles, the little traditions my mother always did for Trevor. The kitchen was empty. When my mother finally came downstairs an hour later, she looked surprised to see me sitting at the table. "What are you doing up so early?" she asked, reaching for the coffee pot. "It's my birthday," I said, my voice small. She paused for just a moment, her back to me. "Oh, right. Happy birthday, Miranda." There was no art set, no special breakfast, not even a card. Later that day, she brought home a small chocolate cupcake from the grocery store and a pair of socks I needed anyway. Just 3 months earlier, for Trevor's birthday, she had thrown a backyard party with all his friends. She had spent days decorating, ordered a custom cake shaped like a football, and gifted him the new video game system he wanted. The contrast was stark and painful, a pattern that would repeat year after year. My academic achievements were another area where the disparity was clear. I worked incredibly hard in school, driven by some desperate hope that perfect grades might finally earn my mother's approval. In 4th grade, when I brought home a report card with straight A's and a special commendation from my science teacher for my solar system project, I presented it to my mother with trembling hands. She glanced at it briefly. "That's nice," she said, before turning back to helping Trevor with his math homework, even though he had barely passed. Yet when Trevor improved from a D to a C in English that same year, she proudly hung his test on the refrigerator and took him out for ice cream to celebrate his progress. It seemed that in our household, I was always the one at fault. If something went missing, I must have misplaced it. If the house was messy, I needed to clean up better. If my mother had a bad day at work, somehow my attitude had started her day off wrong. The most painful moment came when I was 11. I had come home early from a canceled after-school program and quietly entered through the back door. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table with her friend Nancy, unaware of my presence in the hallway. "Sometimes I look at Miranda and just feel so tired," my mother was saying, her voice low. "Trevor was planned, you know. We wanted him. But Miranda, she was my biggest regret. If I hadn't gotten pregnant with her, maybe Jack would have stayed. Maybe my life would have turned out differently." I stood frozen, unable to move, my backpack sliding from my shoulder and hitting the floor with a soft thud. Neither of them heard it over Nancy's sympathetic murmurs. I crept back outside and sat on the porch steps for an hour until I could be sure they would expect me home. That night, I cried silently into my pillow, but by morning I had made a decision. If I couldn't earn my mother's love, I would make myself so successful, so undeniably accomplished, that she would regret her words. I would bury the pain deep inside and use it as fuel. The only person who seemed to notice my silent struggle was my grandmother Sarah, my mother's mother. During our Sunday visits to her small apartment, she would always find a moment to pull me aside away from Trevor and my mother. "You are special, Miranda," she would tell me, her weathered hands cupping my face. Don't you ever forget that. Some people just don't know how to see the light in others. These moments with my grandmother became precious lifelines, brief respites from the constant feeling of inadequacy at home. But they were too infrequent to heal the growing wound in my heart. As I moved through elementary school, I developed a perfectionist streak that would follow me into adulthood. Every assignment had to be flawless. Every drawing had to be better than everyone else's. Every science fair project had to win first place. In my young mind, I believed that if I could just be perfect enough, my mother would finally see me, finally love me the way she loved Trevor. But perfection never seemed to be enough, and the words I had overheard that day in the kitchen echoed in my mind during quiet moments: my biggest regret. Those 3 words shaped my understanding of myself in ways I wouldn't fully comprehend until many years later. They became the ghost that followed me, the voice that whispered doubts in my ear whenever I dared to feel worthy of love or success. By the time I reached high school, I had developed a strategy for minimizing my time at home. I joined every club team and activity that would have me constructing a schedule so packed that I often left the house before my mother woke up and returned after she had gone to bed. I was a member of the debate team, the yearbook committee, the school newspaper, and the track team. I volunteered at the local library on weekends and took extra credit projects in nearly every class. My guidance counselor once joked that I must have found a way to clone myself to manage it all. What she didn't understand was that staying busy wasn't a choice. It was a survival mechanism. It was during sophomore year that I met Jasmine Lopez in my advanced English class. Unlike the other friendships I had formed, which were often superficial connections with activity partners, Jasmine saw through my carefully constructed facade of perpetual busyness and unwavering competence. "You know it's okay to just sit and do nothing sometimes," she told me one afternoon as we worked on a project in the library. I had been frantically checking items off my to-do list while simultaneously outlining our presentation and responding to emails from various club presidents. "I don't have time to do nothing," I replied without looking up. "Everyone has time to do nothing," she said, gently closing my planner. "The question is, why you're so afraid to." That simple observation hit me like a physical blow. I found myself confiding in Jasmine about my home situation in a way I never had with anyone else. She became my safe harbor, the one person with whom I could let down my guard. Her family welcomed me into their home for dinners and weekend stays, showing me what a household full of easy affection and mutual respect looked like. The contrast with my own home life was both comforting and painful. When I was 15, my mother unexpectedly became pregnant and gave birth to my sister Lily. I had hoped naively, perhaps, that a new addition to our family might somehow reset the dynamics, giving us all a fresh start. Instead, it seemed to further emphasize the invisible barriers between us. My mother doted on Lily with the same affection she showed Trevor, while I remained on the outside looking in, now the forgotten middle child rather than the neglected younger one. I still remember a parent-teacher conference during my junior year where my English teacher, Mr. Harrington, was enthusiastically praising my analytical essay on The Great Gatsby. "Miranda has a real gift for critical thinking," he told my mother. "Her writing is at a college level already." My mother nodded politely, then said, "If only my daughter could apply that same focus to helping more around the house." Mr. Harrington looked confused for a moment, then continued, "Well, as I was saying, Miranda is one of the strongest students I've had in years." My mother smiled tightly. If only all my children could be such good students. I sat there simultaneously present and erased. She hadn't even acknowledged that the accomplished student being discussed was sitting right beside her. I was a hypothetical daughter, an abstract concept, rather than the flesh and blood girl in the chair. The accumulation of such moments took its toll. When I turned 16, I went through a brief period of rebellion. I dyed my hair black, started wearing dark clothes and heavy eyeliner, and began hanging out with a group of seniors known for their weekend parties. I started drinking at these gatherings, not enough to become addicted, but enough to temporarily blur the sharp edges of my pain. It was Jasmine who pulled me back from this self-destructive path. After I showed up at her house one Sunday morning, still in yesterday's clothes and reeking of cigarettes and cheap beer, she didn't lecture me or express disappointment. She simply said, "This isn't you, Miranda, and it's not going to fix what's broken." She was right, of course. The brief attention my behavior garnered from my mother came in the form of irritation and disgust, not the concern or care I had secretly hoped for. Within a month, I had abandoned the rebellion and channeled my energy back into what had always been my true escape plan: academic excellence that would take me far away from home. I applied to colleges in secret with Jasmine's parents, helping me navigate financial aid forms and application fees. I targeted schools in New York, California, anywhere that would put significant distance between my mother and me. When my acceptance letter from New York University arrived along with a substantial merit scholarship, I felt a surge of triumph and relief so powerful it brought me to my knees in Jasmine's bedroom, where I had been checking the mail daily to intercept any college communications. When I finally told my mother about my plans just 2 months before graduation, her response was predictably dismissive. "New York? That's ridiculous. It's expensive and dangerous. You should go to the state school like Trevor did." "I got a scholarship," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "It covers most of the tuition. And the rest? And living expenses. You haven't thought this through, Miranda. You never do." The argument escalated with years of pent-up resentment fueling my responses. I finally snapped and told her I knew what she had said to Nancy years ago, that I knew I was her biggest regret. Her face went pale, then hardened. "If you're so determined to leave, then go. One less thing for me to worry about." Those words, delivered with such cold finality, should have hurt more than they did. Instead, they confirmed what I had always suspected: my absence would be a relief to her, not a loss. My high school graduation ceremony took place on a sweltering June day. As I sat in my cap and gown, I scanned the audience, spotting Jasmine's family waving enthusiastically. My grandmother Sarah was there too, despite her failing health, her proud smile visible even from a distance. But the seats I had reserved for my mother, Trevor, and baby Lily remained conspicuously empty throughout the ceremony. When my name was called to receive my diploma and the additional honors I had earned, the applause seemed to come only from Jasmine's family and my grandmother. It was both a heartbreaking and liberating moment, a perfect encapsulation of what I was leaving behind and why I needed to go. After the ceremony, my grandmother hugged me tightly, slipping a small envelope into my hand. "For your fresh start," she whispered. "I'm so proud of the woman you're becoming, Miranda. So proud." Inside was $500, a fortune from her fixed income, and a note that simply read, "Your worth isn't determined by those who fail to see it." 2 months later, I boarded a bus to New York City with 2 suitcases and my grandmother's words tucked safely in my wallet, ready to begin the next chapter of my life, one where I would no longer be defined by my mother's regret. Arriving in New York City as an 18-year-old from suburban Boston was like landing on another planet. The noise, the pace, the sheer number of people rushing in every direction overwhelmed my senses those first few weeks. My dormitory room was tiny, shared with a girl named Alyssa from Seattle, who seemed just as shell-shocked as I was. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. No one knew me here. No one had any preconceived notions about who I was or what I was worth. For the first time in my life, I could define myself on my own terms, but I had spent so many years trying to prove my value to my mother that I wasn't entirely sure who I was without that driving force. During the first week of classes, I attended a mandatory academic advisement session where I met Dr. Elizabeth Patterson, a professor in the communications department who would become one of the most influential people in my life. With her silver bob haircut, bright red lipstick, and tendency to gesture expressively when speaking, Dr. Patterson immediately commanded attention in any room. After reviewing my high school transcripts and the course selection I had made, she peered at me over her reading glasses. "You've chosen quite the academic load for your first semester," she observed. "Any particular reason you're in such a hurry?" I gave her my practiced response about wanting to make the most of my scholarship, but she continued to study my face in a way that made me feel uncomfortably transparent. "Miranda," she said finally, "college isn't just about collecting credits and grades as quickly as possible. It's about discovering who you are and what truly excites you." She tapped my course list with her pen. I see a student who's running towards something or perhaps away from something, but I don't see any joy in these selections. Her words struck a chord so profound that I found myself blinking back unexpected tears. Dr. Patterson gently suggested that I drop 2 of my 7 classes and instead add an elective in something I'd never tried before, something just for the pleasure of learning. On her recommendation, I enrolled in an Introduction to Graphic Design course. From the first session, as we discussed the psychology of visual communication and the power of imagery to evoke emotion, I felt a spark of genuine interest that had nothing to do with proving my worth and everything to do with pure creative fascination. That course changed the trajectory of my college experience and ultimately my career. I discovered that I had both an eye for design and a strategic mind that could connect visuals to broader marketing objectives. By the end of that first semester, I had declared a major in communications with a focus on visual media and marketing. As my academic path clarified, I also began to form meaningful friendships, though not without difficulty. Years of emotional neglect had left me with a deep-seated fear of abandonment that manifested in different ways. I would either become overly accommodating, afraid to express any needs or disagreements that might drive people away, or I would preemptively distance myself, convinced that everyone would eventually lose interest in me. Alyssa. My roommate noticed this pattern and called me out on it one night during our second semester. "You know, for someone who works so hard to be liked, you sure make it difficult for people to actually get close to you," she said, as we shared a late-night pizza. "It's like you've got one foot out the door in every friendship." "That's not true," I protested, though I knew it was. "Miranda, we've been living together for 7 months, and I still don't know basic things about you, like what your favorite movie is, or why you never talk about your family." That conversation marked another turning point. Slowly, I began to open up to Alyssa and the small circle of friends we had formed. I shared carefully curated versions of my childhood, at first testing the waters to see if revealing my pain would indeed drive them away. When it didn't, when they responded with empathy rather than judgment or dismissal, I found myself able to be more authentic than I had ever been. Meanwhile, the financial reality of attending an expensive university in one of the most costly cities in the country began to hit hard. My scholarship covered about 70% of my tuition, but not room and board, textbooks, or living expenses. I had arrived with my grandmother's $500 and about $2,000 I had saved from part-time jobs in high school, but by the middle of my sophomore year, those funds were depleted. I took on work wherever I could find it. I shelved books at the university library in the early mornings, waited tables at a campus cafe between classes, and spent weekends as a retail associate at a clothing store in Soho. The schedule was grueling, often leaving me with just 5 hours of sleep a night, but the alternative of asking my mother for financial help was unthinkable. Despite these challenges, I thrived academically. My professors in the communications department began to take notice of my work, particularly my projects that combined strategic thinking with innovative design elements. By the end of my sophomore year, I had earned a prestigious departmental scholarship that eased my financial burden considerably and validated my growing sense that I had found my calling. I also secured a coveted summer internship at a boutique advertising agency in Manhattan, where I was able to apply classroom theories to real-world campaigns. The creative director, Nadia Williams, became another important mentor, showing me not just design techniques, but how to navigate professional environments as a young woman with confidence. Throughout these years, my contact with my family remained minimal. I would call home on major holidays. Brief, awkward conversations where my mother would pass the phone to Trevor, who would ask general questions about New York before handing the phone to Lily. At 4 years old, my little sister was the only one who seemed genuinely excited to talk to me, chattering about her preschool adventures and asking when I would visit, a question I always deflected. The truth was, I had no plans to return. I had created a new life for myself, one where I was valued for my talents and contributions, rather than dismissed or ignored. The distance, both physical and emotional, felt necessary for my survival. Then, during the fall semester of my junior year, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was my mother's neighbor, Mrs. Geller, informing me that my grandmother Sarah had suffered a stroke and was hospitalized in critical condition. Without hesitation, I booked a bus ticket back to Boston, the first time I would return home in over 2 years. Walking back into my childhood house felt surreal, like stepping into a photograph that had once been familiar, but had somehow altered while I wasn't looking. Lily, now nearly 5, regarded me with shy curiosity, hiding behind my mother's legs when I first arrived. Trevor, home from his job in insurance sales, gave me an awkward half hug. My mother simply nodded in acknowledgement before turning back to preparing dinner, as if my arrival was no more noteworthy than the mail delivery. "Your grandmother's in room 412, she said over her shoulder. "Visiting hours end at 8. I dropped my bag in my old bedroom, now converted into a storage space with just enough room for an air mattress on the floor, and headed straight to the hospital. Seeing my grandmother, the woman who had been my one consistent source of love and support, looking so small and fragile in the hospital bed, broke something inside me. I held her hand, talking to her, even though the doctors weren't sure she could hear me telling her about my life in New York, my studies, my dreams. She never regained consciousness. 3 days later, she passed away peacefully in her sleep with me by her side. The loss was devastating, severing my last meaningful connection to my childhood home and the only person who had ever made me feel truly seen within my family. The funeral was small, held at the local church my grandmother had attended faithfully for decades. As family members and friends gathered afterward at my mother's house, I overheard her talking to a distant cousin in the kitchen. "It's such a shame Miranda couldn't be bothered to visit before this," she was saying, her voice low but perfectly audible to me in the hallway. Too caught up in her new life in New York to spare time for the grandmother who adored her. The injustice of her words, the complete rewriting of our family's reality, sent a surge of anger through me so powerful I had to step outside to catch my breath. She had never once suggested I should visit my grandmother. She had barely communicated with me at all. And now she was painting me as the neglectful one. Before leaving to return to New York, I made one last attempt at connection. I invited my mother to dinner, just the two of us, at a restaurant near our house. "I have to watch Lily," she said immediately. "Trevor could watch her for a couple of hours," I suggested. "He has plans." "What about this weekend before I leave?" "I don't think that would work either, Miranda. I'm very busy these days." The rejection was so routine, so expected, that it barely registered as pain anymore. What I felt instead was a cold clarity, a final understanding that no achievement, no success would ever be enough to make my mother see me as anything other than her biggest regret. I returned to New York more determined than ever to build a life so undeniably successful that her dismissal of me would someday be revealed as her loss, not mine. But beneath that determination lay a deeper wound that neither academic honors nor professional achievements could heal: a fundamental question that would haunt me for years to come. What was so inherently unlovable about me that my own mother couldn't bring herself to care? After graduating summa cum laude from NYU, a ceremony my family once again did not attend, I accepted a position at Meridian Creative, a mid-sized advertising agency with a growing roster of notable clients. The salary was modest by New York standards, but the opportunity to work across various accounts and gain broad experience made it an ideal first job. The agency occupied 2 floors of a converted warehouse in Chelsea, with exposed brick walls, open workspaces, and large windows that flooded the office with natural light. It was there that I met Aaron Matthews, a copywriter who had joined Meridian 6 months before me. With his thoughtful demeanor, dry sense of humor, and genuine passion for creative work, Aaron quickly became someone I looked forward to seeing each day. We were assigned to the same project team for a campaign promoting a new line of sustainable clothing. Our working styles complemented each other perfectly, his carefully crafted words pairing seamlessly with my visual concepts. Late nights brainstorming over takeout food and early morning coffee runs gradually evolved into conversations that went beyond work, revealing shared interests in independent films, obscure bookstores, and a mutual love for exploring different neighborhoods of the city on foot. Aaron became the first person I truly allowed myself to be vulnerable with since Jasmine. One evening, after our team had successfully pitched a campaign to a major client, the group went out to celebrate at a nearby bar. As the night progressed and others drifted home, Aaron and I remained talking in a quiet corner. "You know what I've noticed about you?" he said, his expression thoughtful. "You never talk about celebrating your wins with your family. Everyone else calls their parents after a big presentation, but you never do." The observation caught me off guard. I had become so accustomed to compartmentalizing my family history to presenting a carefully edited version of myself to the world that I hadn't realized how obvious the omission might be. My family and I aren't close, I said, attempting to sound casual. I gathered that much, Aaron replied. But there's a sadness that comes over you sometimes when you think no one's looking. I just wanted you to know that if you ever want to talk about it, whatever it is, I'm here. Perhaps it was the warmth in his eyes, or the genuine concern in his voice, or simply the accumulated weight of carrying my story alone for so long, but something prompted me to share the truth that night. I told him about growing up as my mother's biggest regret, about the years of emotional neglect about my grandmother's love and subsequent loss. Aaron listened without interruption, without the awkward platitudes or uncomfortable shifting that often accompanied such revelations. When I finally fell silent, he reached across the table and took my hand. "Thank you for trusting me with that," he said simply. "It helps me understand why you're so driven so hard on yourself when anything isn't perfect. But Miranda, you should know something. Your mother's inability to see your worth doesn't diminish it in any way. That's her failure, not yours." Those words, so similar to what my grandmother had told me years ago, broke something open inside me. For the first time since her death, I allowed myself to cry openly about all I had lost and never had. Aaron simply held my hand and sat with me in that moment, neither trying to fix my pain nor minimizing it. From that night forward, our relationship deepened beyond friendship. Aaron became my partner in every sense, supporting my ambitions, while gently challenging my tendency toward workaholism and perfectionism. He helped me see that I deserved love, not because I had earned it through achievement, but simply because I existed. Meanwhile, my career at Meridian was advancing rapidly. My design work for a healthcare client had won an industry award, bringing attention to both me and the agency. Within 18 months of being hired, I was promoted to senior designer, managing junior creatives and taking the lead on campaign concepts. By my third year, I had been promoted again to associate creative director, an unusually fast ascent that generated both admiration and some resentment among longer-tenured colleagues. During this period of professional growth, I received the news that my grandmother Sarah had left her small apartment to me in her will, along with her modest savings. The inheritance wasn't substantial in monetary terms, but the fact that she had chosen to leave her entire estate to me, rather than dividing it among all her grandchildren, felt like a final affirmation of our special bond. I decided to sell the apartment and use the proceeds as seed money for an idea that had been forming in my mind, starting my own design and marketing firm that would focus on helping businesses with social impact missions amplify their messages. It was a risk, particularly in a city as competitive as New York, but the prospect of building something that fully aligned with my values and vision was irresistible. Before I could implement this plan, however, my grandmother's funeral brought me back to Boston for the second time since leaving for college. The experience was even more alienating than my previous visit. At the small gathering after the service, I overheard my mother telling an elderly aunt, "It's such a shame that Miranda has become so caught up in her career that she doesn't have time for family anymore. Mom would have loved to see her more before she passed." The comment, so blatantly revisionist of our actual history, left me speechless. My mother had never once encouraged me to visit, had never facilitated any connection between my grandmother and me after I left for college. Yet here she was, casting me as the selfish career woman who had neglected family bonds. When I returned to New York, emotionally drained from the trip, I decided to make one more attempt at bridging the gap with my mother. I called and invited her to visit me in New York, offering to pay for her ticket and accommodations, suggesting she could bring Lily for a girls' weekend in the city. "I don't think that would be a good idea, Miranda," she said, her tone dismissive. "Lily has her dance classes on weekends, and I'm sure you're very busy with your work." "Mom," I said, trying to keep the frustration from my voice, "I'm trying to make an effort here. Don't you want to see where I live, what my life is like now?" "What would be the point?" she asked, and the casual cruelty of the question stunned me into silence. After a moment, she added, "Trevor tells me you're doing well at your job. That's good. You always were focused on your career." The conversation ended shortly after leaving me with a familiar hollow feeling and a renewed certainty that no matter what I achieved, my mother would never see me as worthy of her time or interest. It was a painful realization, but also a clarifying one. I couldn't keep seeking approval from someone determined not to give it. Aaron found me that evening sitting on the fire escape of our apartment building, staring out at the city lights. "Bad call home?" he asked, climbing out to join me. I nodded, too emotionally exhausted to rehash the details. "You know," he said after a while, "there's a quote I read once about how the most powerful thing you can do in life isn't seeking approval from those who withhold it, but rather building something so meaningful that their approval becomes irrelevant." His words resonated deeply. Perhaps that was the true path forward, not proving my worth to my mother, but creating a life so aligned with my values and so rich in meaningful connections that her approval or lack thereof ceased to matter. That night, I made the decision to move forward with my plan to start my own company. If my mother saw me as nothing more than a career-obsessed daughter who had abandoned her family, then perhaps it was time to embrace that identity fully, to build a career so impactful and successful that it would be impossible to dismiss. With Aaron's encouragement and support, I began laying the groundwork for what would become Clarity Design, a creative agency focused on amplifying the messages of socially conscious businesses and nonprofits. I had no way of knowing then how this decision, born partly from pain and defiance, would ultimately lead to both professional fulfillment and an unexpected pathway back to the family connection I had given up on. Founding Clarity Design was both the most terrifying and exhilarating decision of my life. I left the security of my position at Meridian Creative, cashed out my modest savings, and used my grandmother's inheritance to rent a small office space in Brooklyn. The space wasn't much, just a converted loft with concrete floors and walls that needed painting, but it represented a new beginning, a declaration of faith in my own vision and abilities. I didn't start alone. I convinced Jessica Way, a brilliant digital strategist I had worked with at Meridian, to join me as a partner. With her analytical mind and data-driven approach to campaigns, she perfectly complemented my more intuitive creative process. We also brought on Marcus Thompson, a developer with an exceptional eye for user experience, to round out our founding team. The early days were lean and uncertain. We worked around the clock, taking on any projects we could find, while simultaneously trying to build a portfolio that would attract the socially conscious clients we really wanted to serve. There were months when none of us drew a salary, when I lay awake at night wondering if I had made a catastrophic mistake, if my drive to prove myself was leading us all to financial ruin. Aaron was my rock during this period. He continued his work as a copywriter at another agency to provide stability while supporting Clarity Design with freelance work in the evenings and weekends. He never once questioned my decision or suggested I should have stayed in my secure job even during the most stressful times. "This is what you were meant to do," he would tell me when doubt crept in. "You're building something that matters, Miranda. Something that's genuinely yours." 6 months into our venture, we were scraping by with small projects and local clients when an unexpected opportunity arose. A women-owned sustainable fashion brand called Terra Threads was looking for a complete rebrand and marketing strategy for their upcoming expansion. Their founder, Natalie Chen, had seen a small campaign we had done for an environmental nonprofit and reached out directly. The project budget was more than all our previous work combined, but it came with enormous pressure. Terra Threads was taking a significant risk in trusting their rebrand to such a new agency. If we failed to deliver, it could sink not just the project, but our entire fledgling company. For 2 weeks, our team worked virtually non-stop, developing a comprehensive strategy that went beyond mere aesthetics to tell the deeper story of Terra Threads' commitment to ethical production and environmental sustainability. When presentation day arrived, I was running on caffeine and determination, having slept barely 3 hours the night before finessing our pitch. Natalie and her team sat silently through our presentation, their expressions unreadable. When we finished, there was a moment of excruciating silence before Natalie broke into a wide smile. "This is exactly what we've been looking for," she said. "You understand our mission in a way none of the larger agencies did." We won the contract, and the Terra Threads rebrand became our breakthrough project. The campaign received industry recognition and, more importantly, helped the company increase their sales by 40% in the first quarter after launch. Natalie became not just a client, but an advocate, referring other businesses to us and featuring Clarity Design in interviews about Terra Threads' successful expansion. From that point, our trajectory changed dramatically. We moved to a larger office space, hired additional designers and strategists, and began to attract the purpose-driven clients we had always wanted to serve. Within 2 years of founding Clarity Design, had grown from 3 people in a Brooklyn loft to a team of 15, with a reputation for creating authentic, impactful campaigns for companies committed to social and environmental good. As the company flourished, so did my personal life. Aaron and I had moved in together shortly before I started Clarity, and our relationship deepened through the challenges and triumphs of those early business years. On the night we celebrated our 3rd anniversary, after a quiet dinner at our favorite neighborhood restaurant, Aaron surprised me by getting down on one knee. "Miranda Adams," he said, holding a simple but beautiful ring. "You are the most remarkable person I've ever known. Your strength, your creativity, your huge heart that you try to hide but can never quite manage, to your determination to build something meaningful in this world, all of it makes me want to build a life with you. Will you marry me?" The joy I felt in that moment was overwhelming, but even as I said yes and fell into his embrace, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that something was still missing. Despite all I had achieved, despite finding a partner who truly saw and loved me, there remained a hollow space where family connection should have been. I had maintained minimal contact with my mother and siblings over the years. Holiday cards and occasional brief phone calls that never went deeper than surface pleasantries. Lily, now 9 years old, was the only one who seemed genuinely interested in my life, asking eager questions about New York and my work whenever we spoke. I had sent her art supplies for her birthday, receiving a thank you note in childish handwriting that I kept pinned to my office bulletin board. Aaron understood my complicated feelings about family better than anyone. When we discussed our engagement and future wedding plans, he gently asked if I wanted to invite my mother and siblings. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to just start fresh, to create our own family without the baggage of my past. But another part feels like that would be letting her win, somehow acknowledging that the relationship is too broken to even try." "It's not about winning or losing, Miranda," Aaron said carefully. "It's about what would bring you peace. Whatever you decide, I'm with you." I didn't have to make an immediate decision, but the question lingered in the back of my mind as I threw myself into both wedding planning and a major new client project for Clarity. Then, about a month after our engagement, I received an unexpected email from Eliza Montgomery, a prominent business journalist who wanted to profile me for a feature series on women entrepreneurs who were changing the advertising landscape. The article would focus on both Clarity Design's mission-driven approach and my personal journey to founding the company. I agreed to the interview with a mixture of pride and trepidation. While I was genuinely proud of what we had built at Clarity, I had always been private about my personal background, rarely discussing my family or childhood in professional settings. However, Eliza's thoughtful questions and evident research into our company's work put me at ease during our conversation. When the article was published in Business Innovator magazine, it was more personal than I had anticipated. Eliza had woven the story of Clarity's founding with elements of my background that I had shared, creating a narrative about overcoming personal obstacles to build something meaningful. While I had been careful not to explicitly discuss my relationship with my mother, I had spoken about growing up in an environment where I felt I had to prove my worth through achievement, and how that had both driven me and created patterns I later had to overcome. The profile was beautifully written and extremely positive, highlighting Clarity's work and our commitment to amplifying the voices of socially responsible businesses. The response was overwhelming, with new client inquiries flooding in and several industry publications picking up the story. I was simultaneously thrilled by the recognition of our company's work and slightly uncomfortable with the personal attention. 3 days after the article was published, my assistant Julia knocked on my office door with an unusual message. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her expression suggesting this wasn't a typical client meeting. "She says she's your mother." I felt the blood drain from my face. "My mother? Here," Julia nodded. "She doesn't have an appointment. I can tell her you're in meetings all day if you want." For a moment, I was tempted to take the easy way out to avoid the confrontation. But something stronger, perhaps the confidence that comes from building something successful on your own terms, pushed me to face this unexpected visitor. "No," I said, standing and smoothing my skirt nervously. "Show her in." When my mother walked through my office door, it was like seeing a ghost from another life. She looked older, of course, with more gray in her hair and lines around her eyes, but her posture was still rigid, her expression still carefully controlled. She was clutching a copy of Business Innovator magazine in one hand. "Hello, Miranda," she said, her voice formal as if greeting a stranger. "Mom," I replied, equally formal. "This is unexpected." She glanced around my office, taking in the awards displayed on one wall, the framed client testimonials on another, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. I couldn't read her expression, whether she was impressed or looking for flaws to criticize. "I read this," she said, finally holding up the magazine. "Is this what you think of our family, that you had to escape us to succeed?" The accusatory tone was so familiar, so reminiscent of every interaction from my childhood, that I almost laughed from the bitter recognition of it. Even now, faced with tangible evidence of my success, she could only frame it as an attack on her. "I didn't mention our family specifically in that interview," I said, keeping my voice level. "You didn't have to. It's all there between the lines how you had to overcome your terrible upbringing to become this big success story. Do you have any idea how this makes us look? How it makes me look?" And there it was, the same old pattern. Her concern was not for my feelings or experiences, but for how she appeared to others. Something snapped inside me, a dam breaking after years of carefully contained emotions. "How it makes you look," I repeated, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "Is that really what concerns you after all this time? Not how you made me feel growing up as your biggest regret? Not the fact that your own daughter has built a successful company that you knew nothing about until you read it in a magazine?" She took a step back, clearly surprised by my outburst. "You're being dramatic as usual, Miranda. I gave you everything you needed growing up." "Food and shelter aren't everything, Mom. What about love? What about encouragement? What about a single moment when you made me feel like my existence wasn't a burden to you?" The words poured out of me, years of unspoken hurt finally finding voice. I told her about the birthdays that went unacknowledged, the achievements that were dismissed, the constant message that I somehow wasn't enough. And finally, I told her about hearing her call me her biggest regret and how those words had shaped every aspect of my life since. "I was 11 years old," I said, my voice breaking. 11 years old when I learned that my own mother wished I had never been born. Do you have any idea what that does to a child? For a moment, my mother stood frozen, her face pale. Then her expression hardened again, defensive walls slamming back into place. "You always were too sensitive," she said. "Always taking things the wrong way, making everything about you. This article is just more of the same, you playing the victim to get attention and sympathy. You're an ungrateful, selfish girl, Miranda. After everything I sacrificed for you." The familiar accusation struck with less force than it once would have. I was no longer that desperate child craving approval, but a grown woman who had built a life based on my own values and vision. "I think you should leave," I said quietly. "This conversation isn't productive for either of us." "Gladly," she snapped, turning toward the door. But before she could reach it, it opened again, and Aaron appeared, clearly concerned by what he might have overheard from outside. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, his eyes quickly assessing the situation. "Aaron, this is my mother, Jennifer Adams," I said, the formality feeling appropriate for the strained situation. "Mom, this is Aaron Matthews, my fiancé." Aaron extended his hand politely. "It's nice to finally meet you, Mrs. Adams. I've heard about you from Miranda." My mother shook his hand briefly, her expression guarded. "Have you?" I can't imagine she's had many positive things to say given this conversation. Aaron didn't take the bait for confrontation. Instead, he said something that surprised both my mother and me. "Actually, I've seen how deeply Miranda values family, even when relationships are complicated. It's one of the many things I love about her, that capacity for love even in difficult circumstances." His words hung in the air between us, a different perspective on a situation I had always seen as simply painful. Was it true? Had my longing for family connection, even after years of rejection, been a strength rather than a weakness? My mother seemed momentarily at a loss for words, studying Aaron with a slightly perplexed expression before turning back to me. "Well, I've said what I came to say," she stated, moving toward the door again. "Wait," Aaron said gently. "Maybe we could all take a breath here. I understand there's a lot of history between you two, but perhaps there's also an opportunity in this moment." Both my mother and I looked at him skeptically, neither of us seeing any possibility for reconciliation in the wake of our heated exchange. But Aaron continued, his calm voice a counterpoint to the emotional tension in the room. "Miranda, I've watched you build relationships with clients and team members based on authenticity and mutual respect. Mrs. Adams, your daughter has created a company dedicated to helping businesses communicate their truest values. Maybe there's wisdom in that approach for families too." Before either of us could respond to this surprising intervention, my phone rang with an unexpected call from a number I recognized as my sister Lily's school. Concerned, I answered immediately. "Miranda?" It was Lily's voice, sounding both excited and nervous. "I hope it's okay that I called you at work. Mom's not answering her phone." "It's fine, Lily. Is everything all right?" I asked, conscious of my mother watching me with a strange expression. "Yes, I just wanted to tell you that I saw your article in the magazine Mom brought home. You're amazing. I showed all my friends at school. I told them my big sister runs her own company in New York. Is it true you help companies that do good things for the world?" The pure pride and admiration in her voice brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "It's true," I managed to say. "That's exactly what we try to do." "That's so cool. I've been telling Mom for ages we should visit you in New York. Maybe now she'll finally say yes." I glanced at my mother, who was still standing rigidly by the door, but whose expression had shifted subtly, something unreadable flickering across her face. "Your mom is actually here with me right now, Lily," I said. "She is at your company. That's awesome. Can you show her everything? Maybe take pictures to show me later?" "I'll do my best. I promise, though, I had no idea if my mother would stay long enough for any kind of tour." After exchanging a few more words with Lily and promising to call her soon, I hung up and looked at my mother, who seemed suddenly uncomfortable. "Lily's been asking about you a lot lately," she admitted reluctantly. "Ever since she found some old photographs. She's curious about her big sister." The revelation that Lily had been asking about me, that there was someone in my family who actually wanted a connection with me, shifted something in the atmosphere of the room. I felt a small opening, a tiny crack in the wall that had stood between my mother and me for so many years. Before I could respond, my mother spoke again, her voice less hostile than before. "Trevor reads your articles too, the ones about your company's work. He's mentioned them a few times." This was news to me. I hadn't spoken to Trevor in years beyond brief holiday exchanges. The thought that he had been following my career from a distance was unexpectedly touching. The tension in the room had shifted, not disappeared, but transformed into something more complex than simple anger or defensiveness. Aaron, sensing the change, gently suggested that perhaps I could show my mother around the office before she left, an olive branch of sorts. To my surprise, she nodded. "I suppose I should see what all the fuss is about," she said, in what might have been an attempt at humor. As I led her through our creative spaces, introducing her to my team and showing her examples of our work, I watched her take it all in with increasingly thoughtful eyes. She didn't offer praise or express pride, but neither did she look for flaws to criticize. It was a neutral observation, perhaps the closest thing to respect she was capable of showing at that moment. When we returned to my office, she paused before leaving and said something that caught me completely off guard. "You were right about some things," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I wasn't the mother you deserved. There were reasons, not excuses, but reasons. Things happened before you were born that affected how I saw you." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was more acknowledgement than I had ever received from her. It was a small opening, a tiny possibility that perhaps there was more to our story than I had understood as a hurt child. "Would you be willing to talk about those reasons sometime?" I asked carefully. She hesitated, then nodded once, a brief tense movement. Not today, but maybe soon. As she left, I felt shaken as if the ground beneath me had shifted. The confrontation I had feared for so long had happened, and while it hadn't resulted in a miraculous reconciliation, neither had it closed the door completely. Instead, it had left us in an unexpected liminal space somewhere between the old pattern of hurt and rejection and some undefined new possibility. Aaron found me sitting at my desk after my mother had gone, staring out the window at the city below. "You okay?" he asked, pulling up a chair beside me. "I don't know," I answered honestly. I've spent so many years trying to prove myself to her, and when she finally saw all this, I gestured around my office. It didn't feel like I thought it would. It didn't feel like winning. Aaron took my hand. Maybe because it was never about winning or losing in the first place. Maybe it's about healing, and that's a lot messier and more complicated than victory. As I leaned against his shoulder, I realized he was right. The path forward wasn't about proving my mother wrong or right, but about finding a way toward my own wholeness, whether that included a renewed family relationship or not. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that my mother's coldness might have come from her own wounds, her own unresolved pain, rather than some inherent unworthiness in me. It was a perspective that would change everything in the months to come. 1 year after the unexpected confrontation in my office, Clarity Design had grown into one of the most respected boutique agencies in New York. We had expanded to a team of 25 with clients ranging from sustainable fashion brands to renewable energy startups to educational nonprofits. Our campaigns were winning industry awards, and I had been named to a 40 under 40 list of influential business leaders. Professional success had never been the problem, though. It was the personal realm where the most significant changes had occurred over that year. The day after my mother's visit to Clarity, I had received an email from her, brief and formal, but containing something I had never expected: an invitation to talk. We met at a neutral location, a quiet cafe halfway between New York and Boston. The conversation was stilted at first, neither of us quite knowing how to bridge decades of distance. But gradually, as we ordered coffee and then lunch, tentative words gave way to harder truths. My mother revealed what I had never known as a child. She had suffered severe postpartum depression after my birth, left untreated in an era when such conditions were often dismissed. My father, unable to cope with her emotional withdrawal, had abandoned us when I was just 3 months old, explicitly stating in their final argument that he had wanted a son, not a daughter, and that my birth had been a disappointment. His rejection, combined with her untreated depression, had created a toxic association in her mind between my existence and the collapse of her hopes for family life. Trevor knew some of this, she admitted. As he got older, he could see how differently I treated you. He actually tried to compensate to protect you in small ways I probably never noticed. This revelation about my brother surprised me. I had always seen him as simply the favored child, never considering that he might have recognized the inequality and attempted to mitigate it in his own limited way. "None of this excuses how I treated you," my mother said, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly around her coffee cup. "Children shouldn't pay for their parents' wounds. I know that intellectually, but emotionally, I couldn't separate you from my pain for a very long time." It wasn't a Hollywood moment of tearful reconciliation. There were no dramatic apologies or instantaneous healing. Instead, it was the beginning of a slow, often awkward process of getting to know each other as adults, of examining painful patterns with the perspective that only time can provide. Aaron and I proceeded with our wedding plans during this period of tentative reconnection. When the invitations were addressed, I included ones for my mother, Trevor, and Lily, without any certainty that they would accept. To my surprise, all three RSVP'd affirmatively. Our wedding was held in a converted industrial space in Brooklyn, transformed with hanging gardens and warm lighting into something both elegant and welcoming. Standing at the back of the venue in my dress, waiting to walk down the aisle, I felt a presence beside me and turned to find my mother. She looked at me for a long moment, then carefully adjusted a strand of hair that had fallen across my forehead, a maternal gesture so foreign yet so familiar that it nearly brought me to tears. "You look beautiful, Miranda," she said softly. "And what you've built your company, your life here. It's remarkable." It wasn't quite "I'm proud of you" or "I love you," but from a woman who had spent decades unable to offer me even the most basic maternal affirmation, it felt monumental. The ceremony was everything Aaron and I had hoped for: intimate and authentic, surrounded by friends who had become family, and unexpectedly family, who were cautiously becoming friends. Lily, now 10, served as our enthusiastic flower girl, while Trevor gave a brief but surprisingly heartfelt toast at the reception. Following the wedding, the tentative bridges we had begun to build became slowly more stable. My mother, Trevor, and I started attending family therapy sessions once a month, a neutral space where old hurts could be examined and new understandings could take root. The process was painful at times, reopening wounds I thought had scarred over, but it also allowed for a level of honesty that had never existed in our family. Lily, untethered from the older dynamics, became a frequent visitor to New York, staying with Aaron and me for weekends filled with museums, parks, and art projects. At 10 years old, she was showing a creative talent that reminded me of my own childhood interests. But unlike my experience, her enthusiasm was met with encouragement, both from me and increasingly from our mother. Meanwhile, I had begun channeling my experiences into something beyond my own healing. Inspired by conversations with Dr. Patterson, my former college mentor who had remained a friend and advisor, I established a scholarship program through Clarity Design for first-generation college students from challenging family backgrounds. The program provided not just financial support, but mentorship and internship opportunities, creating pathways into the creative industries for talented young people who might otherwise lack access. My mother, somewhat to my astonishment, asked if she could volunteer with the scholarship committee, reviewing applications and helping coordinate events. Her background as a school administrator, a career detail I had barely registered growing up, made her surprisingly well suited to the role. Working together on this project, we found a new kind of interaction, one based on shared values rather than painful history. Trevor, too, found ways to reconnect. He had married and had a son, my nephew Jack, and made efforts to ensure that Aaron and I were included in family gatherings and celebrations. The first Thanksgiving we all spent together as adults was awkward, but not hostile, a marked improvement over the strained holiday calls of previous years. One evening, after a particularly productive therapy session, my mother and I found ourselves alone at a restaurant near the therapist's office. Over dinner, she asked a question that revealed how much our relationship had evolved. "Are you and Aaron thinking about children?" A year earlier, such a question would have felt intrusive or loaded with judgment. Now I could sense genuine interest behind it. "We're talking about it," I admitted. "I want children, but I'm afraid too." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid I'll make the same mistakes. That I won't know how to be a good mother because I didn't have the model for it growing up." The words came out more bluntly than I intended, and I winced, worried about derailing our fragile peace. But my mother didn't retreat into defensiveness. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully. "That's a legitimate fear," she said after a moment. "I had it too, you know. My own mother, your grandmother Sarah, was wonderful to you but quite critical of me growing up. I was determined to be different with my children." A sad smile crossed her face. "Obviously, I failed in that determination with you." "Why were you different with Trevor and Lily?" I asked the question that had haunted me since childhood, finally spoken aloud. She considered this carefully. "Trevor came before the depression, before your father left. And Lily came much later, after I'd had years of therapy myself, though too late to fix what I'd broken with you." She looked directly at me then. "You got the worst version of me, Miranda. The version that was broken and hadn't yet learned how to heal. That wasn't your fault. It was never your fault." It was the closest thing to an explicit apology she had ever offered, and I found myself unable to speak for several moments, tears threatening at the corners of my eyes. "I think," she continued softly, "that your awareness of what can go wrong gives you an advantage in a way. You'll be conscious of patterns I was blind to, and from what I've seen of you with Lily, you have a natural capacity for the kind of attentive love that children need." Her words, this unexpected vote of confidence from the person whose approval I had sought and been denied for so long, touched something deep within me. not because I still needed her validation, but because it signified how far we had both come from the entrenched patterns of my childhood. As the months passed, our family continued this careful rebuilding process. We experienced setbacks, moments when old reflexes reasserted themselves, when a careless word or tone would reopen old wounds. But increasingly, there were also moments of genuine connection, of finding common ground, not through obligation, but through choice. The most significant marker of this change came during our first real family gathering, a dinner at Aaron's in my apartment to celebrate Clarity Design's 5th anniversary. My mother arrived early, helping with preparations in a way that felt almost natural. Trevor and his family came next, his son Jack immediately demanding a tour of every room from his cool Aunt Miranda. Lily, now on the cusp of adolescence, proudly showed everyone the artwork she had created for our anniversary gift, a mixed media piece that now hangs prominently in our living room. As we sat around the table that evening, sharing food and stories, laughing at Aaron's wry observations, and debating good-naturedly about films and books, I had a moment of clarity. This gathering, this tentative new version of family, wasn't about proving my mother wrong after all. It wasn't about showing her my success or worth as some kind of retribution for her early rejection. Instead, it was about something both simpler and more profound, the human capacity for growth and change, for healing even after deep hurt. My mother would never be the nurturing parent I had longed for as a child. Our relationship would always bear the scars of those early years. But we had found a way forward that allowed for new possibilities, new connections that existed alongside, but not in denial of our complicated history. In creating Clarity Design, I had built a company dedicated to authentic communication and positive impact. In rebuilding connections with my family, I was applying those same principles to the most challenging relationship terrain of all. And in both realms, I was discovering that success wasn't about perfection or triumph, but about alignment with core values and the courage to remain open, even after being hurt. A few months after that family dinner, Aaron and I discovered we were expecting our first child. As I shared the news with my mother over the phone, I could sense her genuine joy tempered with an understanding of what this milestone meant for me, for us. "You're going to be a wonderful mother, Miranda," she said, her voice gentle. "Not because you're perfect, none of us are, but because you know the value of being seen and loved for exactly who you are. That's the greatest gift you can give a child." Coming from her, these words carried a unique weight, an acknowledgement of both what she had failed to give me and what she now believed I could offer my own child. As I sit here today cradling my newborn daughter Sophia, I reflect on the long, winding journey that brought me to this moment of profound peace. Clarity Design has become a leader in purpose-driven marketing, working with clients whose missions align with our values of social and environmental responsibility. Our team has grown to 30 people who share a commitment to authentic communication and positive impact. Aaron sits beside me, his eyes filled with wonder as he watches our daughter sleep. My mother stands in the window, a tentative grandmother still finding her way in this new role, but present and engaged in a way I never experienced as a child. Trevor and his family sent flowers and plan to visit next week. Lily, now 12 and fiercely proud of her role as an aunt, has already filled our apartment with handmade decorations for the baby's room. The path to this moment has not been straightforward or easy. The wounds of childhood don't simply disappear with adult understanding. There are still days when an offhand comment from my mother can trigger old pain, when the instinctive flinch of expecting rejection resurfaces. The difference now is that we have tools to navigate these moments, to recognize them as echoes rather than present reality. I've learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting or pretending the hurt never happened. It means integrating that experience into a larger, more complex narrative, one where pain coexists with joy, where difficult beginnings can lead to unexpected new chapters. For so many years, I defined myself in opposition to my mother's dismissal. I was determined to prove her wrong, to become so undeniably successful that her rejection would be revealed as her loss, not mine. What I never anticipated was that the true victory wouldn't be in proving her wrong at all, but in finding a path beyond the binary of winning and losing, a way of relating that allowed for growth on both sides. The company I built, originally fueled partly by defiance, has evolved into something that genuinely reflects my values rather than responding to old wounds. And the family relationships I once thought irreparably broken have gradually transformed into something new, not erasing the past, but creating space for a different future. As I look down at my daughter's sleeping face, I make a silent promise. She will never wonder if she is loved. She will never hear herself described as someone's regret. She will grow up knowing her worth isn't tied to achievement or approval, but is inherent in her very existence. This perhaps is the most profound way I've proven my mother's old words wrong, not through external success, but through breaking the cycle of conditional love, through creating space for a new kind of family story to unfold. What I understand now, in a way my younger self could not, is that people can carry deep wounds that have nothing to do with those they hurt in the process. My mother's inability to love me fully as a child wasn't about my inherent worth, but about her own unhealed trauma. This understanding doesn't erase the impact of her actions, but it does allow me to hold a more complex truth, one where she was both the source of my deepest pain and a wounded person herself. In the end, the greatest achievement hasn't been building a successful company or even rebuilding family relationships. It's been finding the capacity to love openly, despite having learned early that love could be withheld to trust, despite having experienced betrayal, to remain soft in a world that gave me every reason to harden. Sometimes the most powerful response to being told you are someone's biggest regret isn't to prove your value through achievement. Though I tried that path for many years. It's to build a life so aligned with your authentic self that others' judgments, positive or negative, cease to define you. It's to find the courage to remain open to connection, even after being hurt, to offer others the chance to grow and change, just as you hope to do yourself. As I rock my daughter gently in the quiet of the evening, I realize that the true victory was never about proving my mother wrong. It was about finding the strength to write a new story, one where past wounds inform but do not dictate present choices, where the cycle of conditional love ends and a new legacy begins. Have you ever had to prove someone wrong about who you really are? Or found healing in a relationship you thought was beyond repair? Share your story in the comments below. And if this journey resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with others who might need to hear that their worth isn't determined by someone else's inability to see it. Thank you for being part of this community where we can share our truths and support each other's healing journeys.